everybody, welcome back to the Fern Fam YouTube channel. In this week's episode, we're going to go through the steps that we took to build our super simple couch here that's got integrated storage built into it. So what we did is made it where both cushions are removable in our bench. The bottom cushion here is removable, and it opens up into this bottom section that has two spaces to store stuff. This is more than likely where we're going to put all our dog food and dog supplies. And one thing that I did when making this cabinet is it's all made out of 3/4 inch birch plywood. And what I did is I used rabbet and dado joints in order to make it where there wouldn't be a need to put screw holes in the front and have to cover them up later. So for the most part, this bench is completely glued together, and in joinery is used in order to make a nice tight fit instead of having screws hold it together. So we're going to go through the time-lapse footage now and get a little more in-depth and show you exactly what we did in order to make this couch turn out like it did here.
For our first step, we rough cut the wood into the squares and rectangles that we would need in order to make the bench. And one thing that I don't really show here is before I build any piece that goes into the van, I go in the van, I take a lot of measurements, figure out exactly how big and how much space I have to make the piece that I'm going to make, and I make a sketch of it. And on that sketch, I try to make it as detailed as possible, and I go ahead and lay out how the joints are going to join together and how long each individual piece of wood needs to be, the size of all those different pieces of wood, and basically get a plan together so before I start cutting, I know how every piece of wood and where every screw is going to go in that piece that I'm making. And that's one thing that helps cut out a lot of waste when you're doing cabinets and things like that, because quite honestly, I really don't want to waste $50 sheets of birch plywood, so I'm doing everything that I can in order to get it right on the first try. So we've got all the pieces sawn and getting ready to route the joinery into them. And what I'm doing here is I'm making some right angle edge guides that I can clamp onto the boards. These are a commonly used tool in woodworking. Basically, it's like a square that's a lot bigger that you can run a router up against or run a roller bearing router bit up against. Turns out the first set that I made, you can see how narrow they are. Tell I'm a rookie at this basically. If you make it too narrow like I did here, when you try to run the router next to it, the clamps that you use to hold the actual guides down to the wood, they're going to get in the way of the router. So go ahead and save yourself some time. When you make your 90-degree guides, go ahead and make them about 6 to 8 inches wide instead of the 3 inches wide that I made mine. We're getting the final piece of the bench cut here, cutting down to size, and you can see I'm using the right angle pattern that I just made in order to run the skill saw up against. In the previous videos, I used a framing square and clamped it down to the wood, but these right angle jigs, they are a little bit longer and allow me to make one cut all the way through and not have to run the square across and then get halfway across and then unclamp it and clamp it back again. So I would highly recommend making a right angle jig for any time you're going to be doing any type of cabinetry woodworking when you build a van. And actually, this is one thing, when I went to the local tool supply store, I asked if there was any type of these that you could just buy off the shelf, and it turns out that it really doesn't exist. Most people that are doing woodworking, they just make them themselves. So right now, the camera's a little far away from the table. I should have had a more up-close view, but what we're doing is making basically the L-shaped pieces of the bench that'll support the seat bottom and the seat back. And I'm using a router bit after I've made the first one with the jigsaw, which was kind of like my template. I'm using a router bit with a roller bearing on the top in order to get the other two to perfectly match the pattern. And unfortunately, I was using a really old router that was a hand-me-down from my dad. It's a Skill plunge router. I think it was probably made in 1975. And this is the bit that I was using in it. It's basically a 1/2 inch wide and 1 inch deep with a roller bearing on the top. So what you do is you set the depth so that the roller bearing rides on your pattern, and the cutting bit actually cuts the piece of wood that you want to simulate, or that you want to emulate off of the pattern. And this allows you to get basically wood that perfectly matches the pattern that you're cutting, with really no downside to it at all. So what we're doing here is cutting the dado joints that allow for a really tight slip fit. We're using a similar bit in the router. You can see there I've purchased a new router because I got really tired of messing with the old one. And it's the same type of bit with a roller bearing at the top. It's just a little shallower, so it goes on the 3/4 guide a little bit better, and you don't have to plunge in so far on the first cut. Because that's one thing, using routers, you really only want to take out about a 1/4 inch of material per pass. So on that one I was having to take out about a 1/2 inch because I needed the roller bearing to touch the top of the guide, which I just had to cut really slowly so I didn't take out too much material at one time. So we're getting all the dado joints cut, and one thing that I want to emphasize here is that a quality router makes a world of difference. So I upgraded from the 1975 Skill router and bought a Bosch plunge slash fixed base router kit. It's one that was recommended by a friend who runs a woodworking business, and I can see why he would recommend it, because that router is so easy to adjust. You can adjust it 1/64th at a time, and it's really accurate. It's variable speed, so it allows me to run all my router bits that I bought. So if you're wanting to run a bigger bit that cuts specifically made for cutting rabbet joints, you can run that at 1600 RPM versus 2500 RPM, and it'll give you a lot more flexibility and precision. So the couch here that I'm building, I used the old router to complete it all the way through. The joints ended up being not as precise as I would like them to be. There's a couple gaps that I ended up having to fill with putty, and it just didn't, I mean, it glued together nicely, but it's not as precise as I want it to be. Like I said, it got the job done, but the new router on the next couple pieces that I made that we'll get to in later videos, it's amazing the difference between the new router and the old router. So I'll post a link to that exact router below if you're interested in buying this set that I got, and I'll post the bits that I used for cutting all these different joints, because without it I would definitely not have been able to make as clean joints as I was able to make with the new router. So here we're cutting the rabbets and the dados in order to join the bench slash couch together, and one thing about it is I didn't have quite the bit set that I needed, so I ended up having to cut a 1/2 inch dado and then a 1/2 inch rabbet. And it was really, I'm working with 3/4 plywood, so optimally you'd have a 3/8 dado and a 3/8 rabbet that join together half and half. And so that's something later on I bought a couple more bits for the router and made it where I could make perfect joints there as well. So we're getting those cut into the edges. So here's an example of a dado cut and a rabbet cut. So the dado is the one that goes against the grain, and it runs all the way down the piece that's on top. The piece that's on bottom has the rabbet joint cut in them. And the reason that we use this type of joinery is that you get a lot more surface area for the glue to contact. And there's the long-standing argument of which is stronger, a screwed together joint or a glued together joint, and I can say after gluing this couch together, there is not a single doubt in my mind that a glued together joint is stronger than a screwed together joint. Optimally, if you can use both, use both. Like on the back of this cabinet, we'll get to it later, but I screwed and glued the back of this cabinet. So here you can kind of see how the frame fits together and how it works. So the L pieces that we cut, they've got the rabbet joints on them, and they fit into the dados that are cut in the back piece and the front piece. And right now I'm cleaning up the front piece because, like I said, the joints really weren't perfect, and I tried to fix them as best I could and get it back together. But I mean, clearly the joints were tight enough where the couch will sit up on its own. There's no glue on it right now, no screws on it right now, so they were tight enough for that. The next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to cut some stretchers to go across the front of the couch base. And this was to give the seat area a little more support. I wanted to basically make it more rigid from left to right and give a platform for that cushion to sit on. And now the middle L-shaped piece that the seat and back sit on, that one is actually a 1/4 of an inch shorter than the two outside ends. And the reason that I did that is so that I could cut a rabbet joint all the way around the 3 sides of the seat, and it actually sits down inside of the frame there, and that kind of locks it in. Because what I didn't want to happen is when we're going down the road, you hit the brakes and the seat slides off and falls way in. So it's kind of hard to see there, but that one is inset just slightly. So that's all the stretchers clamped in place, and we're just making sure everything fit. So the next thing is we had to make a bottom for our couch as well, because we could have just left it where you look through the bottom and see OSB subflooring, but that's one of those things. I'm putting a lot of time into the van. I really want it to be perfect. So for me, it was worth it to take the extra time and put the bottom in the couch, basically the storage area, so it's a nice clean look when you lift the cushion off. So what we're doing here is using the Craig jig in order to get Craig jig holes in our stretchers that we showed earlier. And the reason we're doing that is, like I said earlier, just to give it a little more side-to-side stability, and Craig joints are pretty strong, and we also glued them as well. So I'm pretty sure you could throw this couch off a cliff and it probably would never come apart. So some people would say that it's a little bit overkill. I say that it's in a van that's moving around and nothing's ever stable. We're going to be on bumpy roads. There's going to be 50 pounds of dog food in this thing. Like, we don't want it to come apart. So to me, it's worth the extra 5 minutes that Lauren's taken here to drill the holes and put the screws in and then get it all glued together. And what I'm doing here is I ended up cutting the dado joint a little too narrow, so my bottom piece, or my L-shaped piece for the seat in the back, wouldn't fit in it. So I'm taking the sander, sanding it down, trying to get it fit, when really I could have just taken the router and opened up the dado joint a little bit. Probably would have been a lot simpler, but you learn something every time you do a process. So next time I'll know, hey, just take the router, run it another pass, and take a 16th off, and you'd be good to go. But I took the stubborn route and sanded it down, and it took quite a while to sand it down to the perfect depth, as you can see, and a lot of tapping it in there with the hammer. Oh, won't quite go all the way down, pull it back out, sand it again. So we're finally to the point here where we're getting the glue process down. So Lauren is helping me out and is wiping glue in the entire joint. So when you're gluing things, you can take the short way out and just gob a bunch of glue in there and clean up later, or you can squirt some glue in there and wipe it around so the glue gets on every single surface inside the joint, so that you maximize the glued surface area, therefore maximizing the strength of the joint. So we wiped it all in, made sure the glue was in all the areas of the joint, and started assembling the table piece by piece. And you can see here we're getting the back put on, and once we get the back put on, that's when we start clamping everything together. So basically we just put as many clamps on it as we could to hold it together and make sure everything was square as much as it could be. And then once we get the clamps on, we're going to take some cabinet screws and actually attach the back with screws. And one of the reasons that I did this is, one, you can't see the back of the couch, and two, I'm going to be screwing the back of the couch into our sub wall that I put in the van, so I really wanted to make sure that the back was super strong. And right here I'm pre-drilling all the holes that I'm going to put screws in. And that's one step that's really important when you're working with finished cabinetry, because you don't want the wood to split on you or crack. That's something that really weakens the wood, and if it is in a place that people can see, it will really look awful. So I'm measuring the center so I can run screws all the way down the center, pre-drilling the center, and putting in the cabinet screws there. So the back of this thing, it's bomb-proof like the rest of it. It's never going to come apart. Probably a little overkill, but rather be overkill than underkill. So here we're getting ready to glue in our stretchers, and those are the ones that we cut the Craig jig holes in earlier, and we probably really don't need to glue them, but since I had a nice flat surface to mate to that I could clamp to, I figured I'd go ahead and glue them in there so it'd be extra support for the seat. So knocking them in with a little glue on the back, clamping them down, and then running the Craig screws in. And that's one thing, it's really important to make sure you have it clamped in really tightly before you run the Craig screws in, because the Craig screws go in at a slight angle. So that causes the pieces of wood to want to walk a little bit. So make sure you have those clamped in before you start running the Craig screws in. One thing that we found when we put it together is that the bottom piece, somehow I got it cut. Actually, the dado joint was not perfectly square, and I think that's the result of one of my 90-degree jigs not being perfectly square either. So I ended up running those through the table saw again and making sure they were square. And so that's what we were putting the filler putty around the bottom. And I'll put a link in the description below to that putty that we're using. It's the most flexible version of DAP sealant that you can possibly get. And we're using that on our van so we don't have flexing and then cracking and that kind of thing. So we put that in. We're getting the last stretchers installed, and unfortunately we couldn't really clamp those for the way that they were, so I just had Lauren hold them while I ran the screws in, and they ended up being fairly close. One thing that you probably noticed throughout the video is I started out working on a set of sawhorses, and now we've got a nice assembly table built. And that's one thing that my friend that owns a woodworking business, he highly recommended that I just go ahead and bite the bullet, spend the time, make the assembly table. And looking back, I wish I would have made this thing before I even started the van. What it is it's simply just 2 sheets of MDF plywood, or actually 1 sheet that I cut in half and stacked on top of each other, with a 1/4 inch sheet of ply on the top of it as a sacrificial piece, and then a frame built under it. And what this does is, 1, gives you a place to work on in the shop, because I really have no other counter space. 2, gives you a place that is perfectly flat. And the reason that you want that is when you start gluing things together, it's really important that you have a flat place to do it on. Like if I had done this on the floor of my garage, there's really no telling how the bench or couch would have turned out. I imagine it would have not been flat at all, and it probably would have really pissed me off. So I highly recommend taking the time to build an assembly table. This is just a 4x4 assembly table. Most people have a 4x8, but it's been super helpful, and I definitely would not try to build another van without one. So what we're doing here is making the seat base, and I'm taking off a little more material off of the rabbet joint in order to make it fit down in there perfectly inside the outer perimeter. And one thing that I kind of realized, the way that we're making the seat cushions, which you're going to see, we're wrapping the fabric all the way around. So that makes it a little more difficult for the seat bottom to fit in there and line up well. So I cut the rabbet super, super deep so there will be enough room for the fabric to fold under and still kind of have a lip that locks the seat in place when we're moving. So we bought some marine grade foam that is one of the firmest settings of foam that you can buy, and we bought enough to do the back and the cushion. And so in trying to figure out how to cut it, I figured if I clamped it down really thin and cut it with a razor blade, it would end up really clean. So I tried that here, and it worked okay. It wasn't the cleanest cut I could ever ask for, but it also wasn't the worst. So I figured we'd try a different approach on the second piece. So we marked it and clamped it down just a little bit with a long 2x4. And then I took a serrated bread knife and cut along the 2x4. And I mean, it gave a pretty straight cut, but the cut was not clean. I mean, you can see all the edges hanging off of it there, and fortunately that was able to be the back of the cushion, so you won't really see it because it'll be underneath the seat back. But we used some 3M 77 spray adhesive. I'll put a link below to that. I'll also put a link to the foam that we're using because we got that off Amazon as well. So we're gluing it down because we didn't want the foam to be walking around on the seat base as you sit on it and lean on it, and like, you know how couch cushions always are running away from you. We didn't really want that to be the case. So we went to our local fabric store, got some gray fabric that Lauren picked out, looks really awesome, and got a staple gun in order to put it on the back. I'll put a link to that below as well if you want to get the same staple gun. It's made by Arrow. It's worked great so far, haven't had any issues with it. So we got our fabric cut out and started stapling it to the bottom of the couch there. And one thing that we did do is we painted the seat bottom in order, one, to seal it so no moisture would get in, and two, just when you open it up, you'll see nice white underneath. Even though there's the seam with all the staples, still looks better than bare wood to me. So we pulled it a little bit snug and started stapling it. One thing that we learned is you really have to be careful that you pull basically an even amount of tension as you run the staples, or as you run down the side with a staple gun, because it'll create high and low spots in the foam based on how hard you pull. So that's something, if I ever make another seat cushion or end up recovering these, I will definitely pay more attention to that. The other thing is the end treatment that we use. Basically, we just wrapped it like a present and folded it over. I would assume in a marine fabrication for boat seats. Actually, I wouldn't assume. I've seen them do this. I've been inside of a boat plant. They actually make like a bag. So they'll start with the seat cushion inside out, sew a seam in it, and then fold it over the starboard and staple it to the back. So you don't have any fold over places, which, looking back, one, if I had a sewing machine, I would definitely do that, and two, if I knew how to sew, I would probably do that. But all in all, the inseams ended up working out pretty well. Here we're working on the final pieces that mount the couch back to the couch. And it turns out that we're able to make two stretchers that run between the L-shaped pieces and a little slip fit wooden bracket basically that slides down over the stretchers and pulls the couch back down onto the couch. And we're going to have another little video that kind of goes into more detail of how that works and how we got it to fit together. So we're drilling the Craig jig holes in those, making sure we can get those in there, and now we are going to install those, take a measurement, and then put the slip fit pieces on the couch back. And the camera's kind of a little far away here, it's kind of hard to see, but basically I just stacked up some 3/4 inch ply in a little L-shaped bracket form, and then took the circular saw and cut them at an angle in order to make them slide down and lock in as they slide down. And this is something I was in a little bit of a time crunch because we had to go somewhere, so I rushed through it a little bit, and it ended up not looking as clean as I would want it to. But it's one of those things that you won't ever see it unless you take the cushion off of the back of the couch, and there's really not much storage behind there. The only thing I would even put back there is, like, I don't know, if I wanted to store a couple books or something, they could fit back there. So it will probably never come off. The bottom piece will slide in and out a good bit of the time, but the top piece really should never come off. So I screwed those down, put some glue in between them, and ran the skill saw in there. Took a couple of tries back and forth to get the angle right for it to slide down and lock in. And we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna do another little video here in a second that'll show how that system actually works. So we're getting those dialed in, and then once we get those dialed in, we're gonna put the cushion on the back. And now when we put the cushion on the back, we kind of skipped a step and didn't glue it in. And this is something, looking back, I don't know if it's really necessary to glue the back in. It was actually a good thing that we didn't, because we needed to shift the foam around. And also, one thing on the back, I tried a different method of cutting it. So I took a really sharp chef's knife and just laid the plywood on top of it and followed the plywood with the chef's knife. And that made the cleanest cut out of all three methods that I tried. So that it was cleaner than the razor knife squeeze after being squeezed down. It was cleaner than the bread knife was after sawing it apart. This basically made a nice, clean, smooth edge and made it where it looked really nice when we wrapped the fabric around it. And on this one, the fabric was a little long, so we took a razor blade and actually trimmed off some of the extra fabric after we stapled it down. So we're running the staples across there, and we're trying harder on this one to make sure that we pulled the same amount so we didn't get that wave effect with different levels of tightness as we worked the fabric around. And it worked out pretty well. There's a little bit of a wave if you really look at the top of the couch cushion when it's installed in the van, but hopefully there will be enough other stuff going on that it will kind of go away. And the end here, this is another thing. We wrapped the one end perfectly like a present, and then I think I trimmed a little too much fabric off of this end, so it ended up being much more difficult to get it to wrap the way we wanted to. We finally ended up watching a video on how to wrap a present just to make sure we weren't going crazy, and then we got it pretty close and put some staples in it, and it actually turned out looking pretty good for what it is. Like I said, it's not like a high-level upholstery job that you'd find in a $100,000 wakeboard boat, but to me, on our couch, I think it looks pretty darn good.
We've got our couch cushion here. I'll do a real quick tutorial on how we did the back portion of the couch and how it mounts to the van. So basically all you do is come over here and pick up, and it slides off of the two stretchers that we have on the back, and it's mounted with two little angle pieces that are screwed and glued onto the back of it. And if you look real closely in here, you can see how we cut that beveled edge there coming down into here so that it locks in real tight when you push it back onto the two stretchers that are on the back of the couch here.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked what you see, hit that thumbs up. If you're ready for more, hit that subscribe button. Make sure you turn on notifications. If you've got any comments or questions, drop those below and we'll get back to you with some answers.